To understand the background of what I'm about to tell you, there's something you need to know about me. I really like otters. Really like otters. I don't know why. I just think they're awesome. Now, my wife Hannah and I, just keep that in the back of your mind. My wife Hannah and I, probably like many of you, enjoy Marvel films. What's cool about the Marvel films is that they tap into different genres. They're all superhero films, but Ant-Man is a heist movie. Captain America: Civil War has plenty of political drama overtones, and Avengers: Endgame really is a war film. Now, one of our favorites within that umbrella is the Guardians of the Galaxy series. They're probably best classified as comedies, or crucially, Guardians 1 and 2 are comedies. There was a time when we were living in London, but visiting family up in Edinburgh, and we had that rare opportunity for a night out. And it had been a bit of a tough emotional week, particularly for me, and I thought, let's go see the third Guardians film. It'll be a good laugh. It's just what I need. Now, those of you who have seen the film are already laughing. You know where I'm going with this. It's a wonderful film, but it's definitely not a comedy. I think tragic origin story would probably work better. They introduce this character, a little otter, who looks after little Rocket the raccoon when he's young. Unfortunately, however, they're all part of a horrible set of scientific experiments carried out by the High Evolutionary, who is an evil scientist. And now Hannah has a better feel for genre sometimes than I do, and she looks over after the otter had been on screen for about a minute, and she says, spoiler alert, honey, you know that otter's going to die, right? I was holding out hope, which was probably not a good idea. I'd been hoping for a nice date night full of laughs, and by the end, I'm just kind of holding back tears on the walk to the car, lamenting the death of a computer-generated otter. It was not my finest moment. Now, you might be wondering why I'm telling you this. Essentially, it's this. Genre is important. It allows us to understand and organize art, music, literature, film, even fashion into different categories. These categories will then have easily recognizable features. Some of us may feel more at home with certain genres than others. For example, within literature, we have the recently emerged genre of tweets. We would expect a tweet to be short, there's a character limit. We expect it to be direct, perhaps in all capitals if you're a certain politician. Maybe include emojis. By comparison, if you're writing to your bank to ask them to extend your mortgage, it's unlikely you would take the same approach. Even if we don't realize we're doing it, there are rules that we all follow with respect to genre. They inform how we understand something. And perhaps not surprisingly, given the number of different authors involved in its construction, the Bible itself is full of different genres. The bulk of Matthew's gospel, which we've been working our way through, is historical narrative. It's essentially a biography of Jesus, right? But there are some different genres embedded in particular sections, and if this passage this week feels a bit of an abrupt shift, that's why. Now, in previous weeks, Jesus has been taking the role of teacher. Now, this week, he's stepping into the role of a prophet. You might think of prophets as people who try to see into the future, and there is actually a bit of that here, but across the Hebrew Bible, the role of prophets was much more about critiquing people and or rulers who had strayed away from God. Matthew's readers, coming from a Jewish background, would spot this instantly with one phrase, woe to you, which is the classic introduction to a prophet calling someone out. The prophets were the original voices speaking truth to power, and often individuals and entities who were so powerful that the prophets were often killed as a result of their message. Now let's look at our first woe. We've got 7 of them this morning. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let those enter who are trying to. As we work our way through this passage, you'll begin to notice these verses do have a bit of a pattern. Most of the paragraphs begin with this phrase, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites." Jesus is calling out the teachers and Pharisees in no uncertain terms. I think most of us would recognize a hypocrite as someone who says one thing and does another. But you might not know that hypocrite is actually a Greek term for an actor who wears a mask during a play. It's as if Jesus is saying, you look like this, but you're actually somebody else. Now, what does Jesus mean when he's talking to them slamming the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces? Well, we've talked about the kingdom of heaven a lot this year. We actually had a whole series on it at one point. And in this passage, Jesus is using it as a bit of a shorthand for what it means to enter into a relationship with God. Clearly, he believes the Pharisees are standing in the way of this, but how? Now imagine we're going to a gig at the Usher Hall. The building suddenly catches fire, and the stewards move quickly to usher everyone out. You finally make it to the exit. The steward should be there, high-vis vest, holding the door open for you. Really, it's their only job, but instead, they slam it shut, locking you in. That's the kind of image Jesus is giving us here. The Pharisees' main job as religious leaders was to point people toward rescue, to the only God who could save his people. And yet, in rejecting Jesus, they not only condemned themselves, but sought to stop others from reaching out to him for help. And if you think Jesus is being pretty strong in his criticism, as you'll see in our passage today, we're just getting started. Jesus continues in verse 15, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You travel over land and sea to win a single convert, and when you have succeeded, you make them twice as much a child of hell as you are." Now, in a sense, Jesus is building on what we just read. Not only were the Pharisees slamming the door to people having a saving relationship with God, they're also trying to win people to that cause. The Pharisees were trying to win people to a classical model of Jewish worship with a bunch of other external commitments bolted onto it. The commentator Michael Wilkins says that they're essentially trying to win converts to their way of thinking rather than God's. And like Matt said this week, we can get into a sort of thought pattern that goes along the lines of, boy, I'm glad I'm not like those Pharisees. But it's easier than you might think. In our efforts to bring people to Jesus, are we ever tempted to try to change other superficial areas of their lives that may not have any connection to the gospel? We can see it happen a lot in church history, particularly when we look at things like colonization and the parallel spread of Christianity. But do we recognize when it happens today? Do we want our friends to simply come to Jesus, or do we want them to start to mirror our social views, our political views, how we dress, maybe our hairstyles? We're thinking about. Jesus' format changes slightly in verse 16. He says, "Woe to you, blind guides! You say, if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing. But anyone who swears by the gold of the temple is bound by that oath. You blind fools! Which is greater, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred? You also say, if anyone swears by the altar, it means nothing, but anyone who swears by the gift on the altar is bound by that oath. You blind men, which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? Therefore, anyone who swears by the altar swears by it and by everything on it. And anyone who swears by the temple swears by it and by the one who dwells in it. And anyone who swears by heaven swears by God's throne and by the one who sits on it." Right. So what's going on here? We don't really have many contemporary equivalents of oaths in our own context. Points where you say something and the very act of saying it, something changes. In our culture, it's often maybe in the form of legal contracts. Think of the oaths that people say when they get married or when children are adopted. Words are said that fundamentally bind people together. So, what were the Pharisees doing with regard to oaths? It seems that, from all the commentators I read, that they were trying to come up with a series of technicalities through which they could weasel their way out of having to keep an oath that they'd made. The schoolyard edition of this is, you didn't say Simon says, something like that. Joe Capalio, one of the commentators I read, he summarizes it helpfully. He writes, the Pharisees' teaching enabled people to make oaths without any real intention of keeping their word. They could be let off the hook on the technicality that, although they had sworn by the temple or by the altar or by Jerusalem, they had not actually invoked the name of God. This was pure deceitfulness hidden under a cloak of modesty. It's as if I were to go out of my way to make a promise about something only to reveal that I actually had no intention of following through with it. We all know intuitively that this would be wrong, but the Pharisees, according to Jesus, had almost made a science out of it. We're up to our fourth woe. We're back to our original intro. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You give 1/10 of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you've neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel. Now, what's all this about spices and gnats? This relates to the religious life of Jews in Jesus' day. The law of Moses had commanded the Israelites to give 1/10 of the yield of their crops. And this is something that makes particular sense in terms of, say, a big harvest of grain. Somebody might be lugging several baskets of grain into the temple as an offering to God. But the harvest that Jesus mentions is of spices, mint, dill, cumin. These are seasonings, garnishes, something that you'd weigh out, tiny little bits on a tiny little scale. And there's something of incredibly low consequence. And yet, Jesus says that the Pharisees' approach to religion is like someone sifting out meticulously weighed, divided mint leaves while ignoring the important things like justice, mercy, and faithfulness. Now, what's this about gnats, you might ask? I think Jesus is making a joke here to underscore his point. He says the Pharisees are making mountains out of molehills. They're the kind of people who, having read in Leviticus 11 that gnats were unclean, would go around everyone's glass at the garden party, removing these tiny little flies that had landed in people's glasses. And at the same time, they would miss the giant camel who was sitting in the punch bowl. They're focusing on the tiny, intricate parts of the law while neglecting love for God and for neighbor. Jesus changes direction slightly in the fifth woe. Starting in verse 25, he says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You clean the outside of a cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and dish, and then the outside also will be clean." Now, unlike some of these prophetic challenges, I think this one is a bit more straightforward. Imagine going to someone's house where they made a big effort to show you that the teacup they were about to hand to you was clean, nice, sparkling clean, and then only for you to look into it and see that somebody else's tea bag from who knows when had dried and sort of stuck to the bottom, and you try to get it out and it does a little thing. It's an unsettling image. This is like peak British cringe, right? And yet in so many areas of life, can we not be tempted to do the same thing? As a parent, I've found it can be incredibly tempting to engage in behavior modification to try and get a quick fix to something my child is doing rather than addressing the root cause of their negative behavior. And it's ultimately the sin that runs through their heart. If I'm being honest, it's also my own. My child doesn't need to be taught how to disguise their sin. They need to be pointed to the Savior who alone can take punishment for their sin. The same is true of each of us. Coming into church, you may feel the need to present the most polished version of yourself. My wife calls this version of me Church Tom. And yet, if we're not honest about our struggles, we may fail to address the issues in our own hearts and to respond to the God who reaches out to save us. More on that in a little bit. Jesus intensifies in the next woe. He says this, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of the bones of the dead and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside, you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside, you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness." Now, what's all this about whitewashed tombs? Part of Jewish custom was that contact with a dead body would render someone ceremonially unclean, and there was a fairly drawn-out series of steps that the person had to take before they could be declared clean again. In fact, the stigma was so strong that anyone who simply came into physical contact with a person's grave would be considered unclean. Remember that the people gathering in Jerusalem just now, including Jesus and his followers, had come to celebrate the Passover. This was a key time of year when people came who weren't from Jerusalem to celebrate this holiday. Now imagine just a few years ago, during the pandemic, you traveled onto your dream holiday. You've got a beautiful Airbnb reserved in the hills somewhere, only to test positive at customs when you arrive in that country, and you're now treated to a week-long stay in quarantine at the local travel lodge. To avoid the possibility of Jewish pilgrims accidentally coming into contact with a tomb and not realizing until it was too late, the custom was to whitewash the tombs so that they stood out, that they would be unmissable. Jesus is effectively saying, it's not the external stuff that's making you unclean, it's coming from within you. It's your own hearts that are corrupted. And the seventh and last woe takes on particularly graphic language. Beginning in verse 29, Jesus says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You build tombs for the prophets and decorate the graves of the righteous. And you say, if we had lived in the days of our ancestors, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. So you testify against yourselves that you are the descendants of those who murdered the prophets. Go ahead then and complete what your ancestors started." I saw a post on the internet this week that kind of stopped me in my tracks. I realize now that that's probably not massively readable. It's someone saying in the American context, if you ever wondered what you would have done in 1930s Germany or during the civil rights movement, congratulations, you're doing it now. Whatever your politics, I think that we can all agree this is intended to shock. It's intended to maybe offend us, cause us to think. Jesus is using similar language here, but with what intention? He returns to the image of a graveyard. The funeral industry, as we know it today, had its own equivalent in the ancient world. In some instances, very grand tombs were built, cut into the rock in the graveyard outside the city walls of Jerusalem with artwork painted and chiseled to show that the person who was buried there was important. The Pharisees evidently had chipped in some resources to redecorate the tombs of noteworthy Israelites, namely the Old Testament prophets. In some instances, these weren't tombs in the technical sense, but monuments in memory of important individuals, which is what you've got here. The one on the right, the pointy one, is a monument to the prophet Zechariah. There's an irony here, though, that Jesus spells out explicitly. The people who are funding the ornate decorations on these tombs and monuments are the physical descendants of those who killed the prophets in the first place. More than that, they are also the spiritual descendants in the sense that they have no problem with plotting to kill Jesus. Jesus knows it, and now he's calling them out for it. Look at that last line. Go ahead and complete what your ancestors started. Can you imagine the blood draining from the faces of the religious leaders? Maybe some eyes darting back and forth to each other, as if to ask, how does he know? Jesus has been predicting his death for several chapters now, but before he's been doing it to pastorally prepare his followers for what was going to happen. Here, he's using the murderous plot of the Pharisees to confirm what the Pharisees didn't want to admit, that they're not only door-slamming, misdirecting blind guides, majoring in the minors, enslaved to a legalistic framework rather than God's law, caring about external experiences rather than the condition of their hearts. That's all true. But he's also saying that they're the descendants of murderers, and they have a murderous intent within them. Jesus doubles down on seventh woe in the final section here. Look how he begins verse 33. You snakes, you brood of vipers, how will you escape being condemned to hell? Therefore I am sending you prophets and sages and teachers. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Others you will flog in your synagogues and pursue from town to town. And so upon you will come all the righteous blood that has been shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I tell you, all this will come on this generation. If the brood of vipers line sounds familiar, it's because it's actually come up in Matthew's gospel before. Back in chapter 3, John the Baptist, a prophet who was working to prepare people for the coming of the Messiah, the promised deliverer, was preaching, and the Pharisees and Sadducees approached him, likely to interrupt his teaching, his baptisms, and he absolutely tore into them, and his retort to them began with the words, "You brood of vipers." So Jesus is underscoring his point about murdered prophets by quoting the last prophet to be murdered. It is worth noting, in fairness, that it was Herod who had killed John rather than the Pharisees or Sadducees, but nevertheless it seems as if something that they would have supported. But notice what Jesus says next. I'm sending you prophets and sages and teachers. He acknowledges that they may be a bunch of vipers, but he's still not giving up on them. He's going to send people like his disciples to point them in the right direction, people who will model ministries that are the very opposites of the woes we've been talking about. And Jesus also readily acknowledges that these prophets, sages, and teachers will not be well received. They'll be persecuted by the religious leaders, and all the while, the same religious leaders will be heaping judgment upon themselves. And Jesus spares no punches about what the end result of this persecution will be. Within a generation of himself, the Jewish people lose their place of relative political safety within the Roman world. They're eventually viewed with suspicion by Roman politicians and military figures, and this culminates in the destruction of their temple. Jesus is effectively saying that their days of being in charge are coming to an end. Now, we began talking about genre shifts. What we've read thus far rightly belongs in the prophetic genre, but the final verses here switch to something else. They switch to a lament. Lament, in the classical sense, is essentially a song or poem or spoken word that unloads a profound sense of grief. It can be tied to mourning or regret, or sometimes just a heavy weight of sadness. Now, while the songs in our gatherings are often intended to allow us to joyfully worship God, the Bible also gives us a vocabulary for reaching out to God in our suffering and in our sorrow. Our passage today started out with loud, bombastic, prophetic critique, but it ends with a quiet and reflective lament. Look at verse 37. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you. How often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing. Look, your house is left to you desolate, for I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Are you surprised by this? It's quite the turn from the prophetic fighting words we started with to this sober, somber lament. And did you notice the other shift that happens? We've had lots of woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, but what does he start with here? Jerusalem, Jerusalem. Jesus has quietly and subtly pulled back our view. He's not just addressing Pharisees and teachers of the law any longer. He's talking to all of the Jewish people here. Our view is expanded. You see, it's not just the Pharisees who've rejected Jesus. The imagery is striking. I can't say I know much about chickens, but the image of a mother hen gathering her chicks under her wings is one that even an admittedly city person like myself can visualize. It's the ultimate image of parental care, of protection, of a loving, nurturing act, keeping fuzzy little chicks safe in a storm. And yet, here we read the ultimate tragedy in the whole passage. They were not willing to be gathered. Jesus longs for his people to recognize that he came to look after them, to shelter them, to save them. And they refused him. Not only did they refuse him, but they were actively opposing him, trying to entrap him, accusing him, plotting to kill him. And in a few short days, they would succeed. There may be many among us today, whether we're following Jesus or just looking into who he is, who struggle to make sense of God's judgment in light of his goodness and mercy. I think passages like this are an important reminder of the profound compassion and love which Jesus has for people who are not saved, the longing he has to see them come to him. Now, what can we say in conclusion and by way of application? Are you perhaps a bit surprised that Jesus' condemnations here were not directed at the occupying evil empire Romans, but at the religious leaders of his own community? I've got a few points of application in mind for those who are followers of Jesus and for those who wouldn't identify in that way. First, for followers of Jesus, are you perhaps guilty of door slamming or maybe misdirecting those who don't know Jesus? There's been a tendency in some corners of the church to first try and reform people's behavior. It ultimately produces a gospel that says you need to behave like us so that you can eventually believe the way we believe, and then finally you can belong to the church community. I think this sort of approach seems to be drawing straight from the Pharisees' playbook. Instead of doing this, I think we can and should emphasize that people are welcome here. They can belong. We hope and pray that this will lead to belief, and then they can join the rest of us on a lifelong journey where God works in our lives to transform us to be more like Jesus. Change may often at times feel slow, but thankfully God is patient with us. There may be those of you this morning who aren't convinced. You've met Christians in the past, you've been to church, maybe you've read about scandals in the newspaper, and all you can see is the hypocrisy of those who preach one thing and practice another. It's a sad reality we must face. The church has failed people We as individuals have failed people. I have failed people. We're all sinful, and we're all desperately in need of God's grace. We're imperfect at best. But as Christians, we do believe that God uses broken people to share his message with the world. But that doesn't mean that Christ's message isn't true. The Bible refers to this as treasures hidden in jars of clay. Maybe an illustration will help. When I was young, I tried to play piano. I wasn't particularly good. I struggled with the whole playing with two hands thing. If you listen to me playing a song, I can assure you that you wouldn't be hearing the best representation of that piece of music, especially compared to people who are good at playing, if our musicians here were playing. But here's the thing. One's ability to play an instrument, or in my case, inability to play an instrument, doesn't actually have any bearing on the beauty of a particular piece of music. If you've explored the Christian faith and you see the inherent beauty in it, if you can see the love of God displayed in it, if you've ever found yourself hoping it were true, can I just encourage you to give it another chance? To read through one of the Gospels in the Bible, to talk to somebody about it? Jesus longs to gather you like a little chick under his wings. He longs to bring you home to a heavenly Father who loves you. He doesn't have a giant checklist of things you need to do to become acceptable in his sight. It's actually the opposite. All you need to do is admit that there's nothing you can bring to the table. And that's what we celebrate when we share bread and wine together. That Jesus' perfect obedience covers our disobedience. That the truth Jesus taught shatters the lies we tell ourselves. That Jesus' death gives us life. And if this is something you're wrestling with, or something you'd like to talk with somebody about, please make the most of that opportunity. There's plenty of people here who would love to talk to you. If Jesus is who he says he is, you've got nothing to lose and everything to gain.